The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs office in downtown Phoenix as Sarah Martinez pulled her beat-up Honda Civic into a space near the entrance. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her nerves. At 28, she had the weathered look of someone who had seen more than her share of hardship. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded navy t-shirt that had seen better days. Sarah had been living in her car for the past 3 weeks, ever since her landlord had evicted her for missing rent payments. The small apartment she had called home for 2 years was now just a memory, along with most of her belongings that she couldn't fit in the back seat. The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who had served her country with distinction was now homeless, but that was a reality many veterans faced when they returned to civilian life. She grabbed the manila envelope from the passenger seat, the one containing her discharge papers, medical records, and other documentation that proved her military service. The VA office was her last hope for getting the benefits she was entitled to, benefits that would help her get back on her feet and find stable housing. She had been putting off this visit for months, partly out of pride and partly because dealing with bureaucracy reminded her of all the things she wanted to forget about her time in the service. As she walked toward the building, Sarah noticed a small group of people gathered near the entrance. They were wearing various military-themed clothing and seemed to be having an animated discussion. She recognized the type immediately: veterans who gathered to share war stories and compare experiences. Normally, she would have walked past without engaging, but something about their conversation caught her attention. "I'm telling you, the Navy SEALs are the most elite fighting force in the world," one man was saying loudly. He was wearing a Navy hat and had multiple patches on his jacket that indicated various military achievements. "I served with some of those guys in Iraq, and, let me tell you, they're not like regular sailors." Another man, this one wearing an army jacket, shook his head dismissively. "Please, the Green Berets could run circles around SEALs any day. We had real combat experience, not just fancy swimming lessons." The first man bristled at this comment. "Swimming lessons? You obviously don't know anything about SEAL training. Hell Week alone would break most soldiers. And don't get me started on the missions we ran in Afghanistan." Sarah quickened her pace, not wanting to get drawn into what was clearly becoming a heated debate about military superiority. She had heard these arguments countless times before, usually from men who wanted to prove their service was more important or dangerous than everyone else's. What bothered her most was how they always seemed to assume that being a SEAL or Special Forces operator was exclusively a male domain. Inside the VA office, Sarah took a number and found a seat in the crowded waiting room. The familiar smell of government buildings, a mixture of disinfectant, old carpet, and too many people in a confined space, brought back memories she would rather forget. She tried to focus on the forms she needed to fill out, but her mind kept wandering to the conversation she had overheard outside. The truth was, Sarah had more experience with SEALs than those men could ever imagine. But that wasn't something she advertised, especially not to strangers who already seemed to have strong opinions about what military service looked like. Her own path to the Navy had been unconventional from the start. Growing up in a small town in New Mexico, Sarah had always been drawn to physical challenges and outdoor activities. While other girls her age were interested in typical teenage pursuits, she was rock climbing, hiking, and participating in every sport her high school offered. Her father, a former Marine, had encouraged her athletic pursuits and taught her to shoot, hunt, and survive in the wilderness. When she turned 18, college wasn't an option financially, and the military seemed like the best way to see the world while serving her country. She had initially planned to join the Marines like her father, but a Navy recruiter had caught her attention with stories about opportunities for women in naval special operations support roles. What the recruiter hadn't mentioned was how difficult it would be for a woman to prove herself in that environment. From her first day at boot camp, Sarah had faced skepticism, harassment, and outright hostility from both fellow recruits and some instructors who believed women had no place in combat-related roles. But she had persevered, driven by a stubborn determination to prove that she belonged. Her exceptional performance in basic training had earned her a spot in advanced combat training, where she excelled in marksmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and tactical operations. It was there that she first encountered members of the SEAL community, and where her life took an unexpected turn. Sarah Martinez, a voice called out, interrupting her thoughts. She looked up to see a middle-aged woman in a VA uniform holding a clipboard. "That's me," Sarah replied, gathering her paperwork and following the woman through a maze of cubicles to a small office. The benefits counselor, whose nameplate read Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed friendly enough as she reviewed Sarah's paperwork. Everything appeared to be in order until she reached the section detailing Sarah's military occupation and deployment history. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion in your records, Mrs. Rodriguez said, frowning at the computer screen. "It shows here that you were assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command, but I don't see any standard ratings that would qualify you for that assignment." Sarah had been dreading this moment. The nature of her service had been classified, and much of what she had done during her time in the Navy couldn't be discussed openly. Even now, years after her discharge, she was bound by secrecy agreements that prevented her from sharing details about her missions and training. "I understand the confusion," Sarah said carefully. "My assignment was somewhat unique. The details should be available through your classified systems if you have the appropriate clearance level." Mrs. Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Ms. Martinez, I've been working with veteran benefits for 15 years, and I'm familiar with most special programs." "What exactly did you do in the Navy?" This was always the difficult part. Sarah couldn't simply say she had been a SEAL, because technically, women weren't allowed in that program during her time of service. But she also couldn't fully explain the covert program that had allowed exceptional women to train alongside SEALs and participate in certain operations where female operators were needed. "I was part of a pilot program that worked closely with Naval Special Warfare Units," she said. "I completed modified SEAL training and participated in classified operations overseas." The skepticism on Mrs. Rodriguez's face deepened. "I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor. Claims like this require additional documentation that I don't see in your file." Sarah felt her heart sinking. This was exactly what she had feared would happen. The program she had been part of was so classified that even many people within the military didn't know it existed. Getting official verification would be nearly impossible without going through channels that could take months. "Is there someone higher up I could speak with?" Sarah asked. "Someone with security clearance who might be familiar with special access programs?" Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "I'm afraid not today. Our regional director is in meetings all afternoon. You'll need to come back next week when he's available, and you'll need to bring additional documentation that proves your claims." As Sarah left the VA office, she felt defeated. The bureaucratic runaround was something she had experienced before, but it never got easier. She sat in her car for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. Going back to sleeping in parking lots and fast food restaurants wasn't appealing, but she was running out of options. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her friend Jessica, another veteran who had helped her navigate some of the challenges of civilian life. "How did it go at the VA?" the message read. Sarah typed back, "Same old story. They don't believe my service record." Jessica's response came quickly, "Have you thought about reaching out to that veteran support group I mentioned? They meet tonight at the community center." Sarah had been hesitant to join support groups in the past. Sharing personal experiences with strangers wasn't something that came naturally to her, and she worried about encountering the same skepticism and disbelief that she faced elsewhere. But she was running out of alternatives, and Jessica had insisted that this particular group was different. That evening, Sarah found herself standing outside the Northside Community Center, once again trying to summon the courage to walk through a door that might lead to disappointment. Through the windows, she could see a circle of folding chairs with about a dozen people sitting and talking. The group appeared to be mixed gender and diverse in age, which was encouraging. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The conversation stopped as she entered, and all eyes turned toward her. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a warm smile stood up and approached. "You must be Sarah," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia, and I run this group. Jessica told me you might be joining us tonight." As Sarah shook Patricia's hand, she noticed the small tattoo on the woman's wrist, a trident symbol that was unmistakably associated with naval special warfare. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't recognize it, but Sarah knew exactly what it meant. "Thank you for letting me come," Sarah said, feeling slightly more at ease. Patricia led her to an empty chair in the circle, and the conversation resumed. Sarah listened as various group members shared their experiences, struggles with PTSD, difficulty finding employment, problems with VA benefits, and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. What struck her most was how supportive and understanding everyone seemed to be, regardless of which branch of service they had been in or what their roles had been. When it came time for Sarah to introduce herself, she kept it simple. "I'm Sarah. I served in the Navy for 6 years and got out about 18 months ago. I'm having some issues with getting my benefits straightened out." "What kind of issues?" asked a man named Carlos, who had mentioned serving in the Army Rangers. Sarah hesitated. "It's complicated. My service record doesn't fit into their normal categories, so they're questioning whether I'm eligible for certain benefits." Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Would you mind if I asked what your rating was in the Navy?" This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. She could either give a vague answer that would probably satisfy most people, or she could tell the truth and risk the same skepticism she had faced everywhere else. "I didn't have a traditional rating," she said finally. "I was part of a special program that worked with naval special warfare." The room fell silent. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention, and she braced herself for the inevitable questions and doubts that would follow. But, instead of skepticism, she saw recognition in Patricia's eyes. The older woman studied Sarah's face carefully, as if trying to remember something important. "What years did you serve?" Patricia asked quietly. 2014 to 2020, Sarah replied. Patricia nodded slowly. "And you completed the full training pipeline?" "Yes, ma'am." The other group members were looking back and forth between Sarah and Patricia, clearly sensing that there was more to this conversation than they understood. But Patricia seemed to know exactly what Sarah was talking about, which was both surprising and reassuring. "How long since you've been back stateside?" Patricia continued. "About 18 months. I did 2 deployment rotations overseas before my discharge." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see that she was weighing her words carefully. Finally, the older woman spoke. "I think I know someone who might be able to help you with your VA situation. Someone with the right clearance level and connections. Would you be interested in meeting with him?" Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Absolutely. I'm willing to try anything at this point. I'll make some calls tomorrow and see what I can arrange. In the meantime, do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" The question reminded Sarah of her current housing situation, which she had been trying not to think about. "I'm between places right now," she said diplomatically. Patricia's expression softened. "There's a transitional housing program for veterans about 10 minutes from here. It's not luxury accommodations, but it's safe and clean. I can give you the contact information if you're interested." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like someone understood what she was going through and was genuinely trying to help. The weight of constant stress and uncertainty seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders. As the meeting wrapped up, Patricia pulled Sarah aside and handed her a business card. "Call me tomorrow afternoon, and I'll let you know if I was able to reach my contact. And, Sarah? Don't give up. Sometimes it takes time for the system to catch up with reality, but your service matters." Walking back to her car, Sarah felt more optimistic than she had in months. She wasn't naive enough to think that all her problems would be solved overnight, but, for the first time since her discharge, she felt like she might have found people who understood what she had been through. She drove to the transitional housing facility that Patricia had recommended, and, after a brief interview with the night manager, she was given a small but clean room with a bed, desk, and private bathroom. As she lay down that night on an actual mattress for the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to hope that things might finally start looking up. The next morning, she woke up feeling more rested than she had in a long time. She spent the day doing laundry, taking a proper shower, and trying to get her life organized while she waited for Patricia's call. When her phone finally rang in the afternoon, she answered on the first ring. Sarah, it's Patricia. I have good news and interesting news. Which would you like first? The good news, please. I was able to reach my contact, and he's agreed to meet with you. He's someone with very high security clearance who has worked with special programs for many years. That's fantastic. What's the interesting news? Patricia paused. Well, it turns out he's actually going to be in Phoenix tomorrow for other business. He suggested meeting at the VA office where you had trouble yesterday. He thinks having him there might help cut through some of the bureaucratic nonsense you've been dealing with. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Who is this person exactly? Someone who will definitely be able to verify your service and help you get the benefits you're entitled to. I can't say much more over the phone, but I think you'll be surprised by how much he knows about your situation. They arranged to meet the following morning at the VA office, and Patricia assured Sarah that her contact would find them in the lobby. As she hung up the phone, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. After months of being dismissed and disbelieved, she was finally going to meet someone who might be able to help her move forward with her life. Sarah arrived at the VA office 30 minutes early, wanting to make sure she was prepared for what could be the most important meeting of her post-military life. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her discharge paperwork and thinking about how to explain her unique service record to someone who might actually understand what she had been through. The lobby was already busy with veterans waiting for various appointments, and Sarah recognized a few faces from her previous visit. She found a seat near the entrance where she could watch for Patricia and her mysterious contact. Her nerves were getting the better of her as she wondered who exactly Patricia had reached out to and what level of authority this person might have. At exactly 9 a.m., Patricia walked through the front doors accompanied by a man in his mid-50s wearing a crisp business suit. He was tall and lean with graying hair and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. Even in civilian clothes, everything about his posture and manner suggested someone accustomed to command and respect. Sarah stood up as they approached, and Patricia made the introductions. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Colonel James Mitchell. Colonel, this is Sarah Martinez, the veteran I told you about. Colonel Mitchell extended his hand with a firm grip and studied Sarah's face with intense blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Ms. Martinez, Patricia has told me a bit about your situation. I understand you've been having some difficulties getting your service properly recognized by the VA. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, falling automatically into the respectful tone she had used with superior officers. I've been trying to get my benefits straightened out, but my service record doesn't fit into their standard categories. The colonel nodded. I see. And what unit were you assigned to during your time in the Navy? Sarah glanced around the crowded lobby, suddenly aware that their conversation could be overheard by dozens of people. I'm not sure how much I can discuss in an open area like this, sir. Colonel Mitchell smiled slightly, apparently pleased by her discretion. Of course. Let's see if we can find somewhere more private to talk. He approached the reception desk and spoke quietly with the clerk, showing some form of identification that Sarah couldn't see. Within minutes, they were escorted to a small conference room on the second floor, away from the bustling lobby. Once the door was closed, Colonel Mitchell gestured for Sarah and Patricia to take seats across from him at the conference table. He pulled out a tablet and opened what appeared to be an official military database. Before we go any further, I need to verify some basic information, he said. Can you tell me your full name, social security number, and dates of service? Sarah provided the requested information, and the colonel entered it into his tablet. His eyebrows raised slightly as he read whatever appeared on the screen. Interesting, he murmured. You were assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group for the majority of your service. That's not a unit most people would be familiar with. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. DevGru was one of the most classified units in the military, and the fact that Colonel Mitchell not only knew about it but had access to information about her assignment there suggested he was much more than just another VA official. Yes, sir. I was part of a pilot program that integrated female operators into certain special operations missions. Colonel Mitchell nodded and continued reading from his tablet. I see you completed the full special warfare training pipeline, including advanced marksmanship, close quarters combat, language training, and Halo certification. Your performance ratings are quite impressive. Patricia leaned forward with interest. I told you she was the real deal, Colonel. Indeed, he replied, still studying the screen. Ms. Martinez, I'm looking at deployment records that show you participated in 17 classified operations across 3 different theaters. That's more combat experience than most male SEALs accumulate in their entire careers. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time since her discharge, she was talking to someone who not only believed her service record but actually had access to the classified information that proved it. She had begun to wonder if she was going crazy, if somehow her memories of her military service were exaggerated or false. Sir, may I ask what your role is? I mean, you're obviously not just a VA benefits counselor. Colonel Mitchell closed his tablet and looked directly at her. I'm currently assigned to the Pentagon as a liaison between Special Operations Command and various government agencies, including Veterans Affairs. Patricia reached out to me because she suspected your situation involved classified programs that regular VA personnel wouldn't have access to. He paused and studied her face again. What I'm curious about is why someone with your background and qualifications is living in transitional housing and fighting for basic benefits. Your discharge appears to have been honorable with full medical benefits authorized. This was the part Sarah had been dreading. Explaining why she had left the military despite having a successful career wasn't easy, especially to someone who had obviously dedicated his entire adult life to military service. The short answer is that I developed PTSD and some physical injuries that made it difficult to continue operational duties, she said carefully. The longer answer is more complicated. I have time, Colonel Mitchell said gently. Sarah took a deep breath. During my last deployment, our team was involved in an operation that went badly. We lost 2 team members, and I was injured in the extraction. Physically, I recovered enough to return to duty, but mentally I was struggling with nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance that was affecting my performance. She looked down at her hands as she continued. The military offered me counseling and medical treatment, but they also made it clear that my psychological issues were seen as a liability for future operations. I was given the choice of accepting a medical discharge or being transferred to a non-operational role. I chose the discharge because I couldn't bear the thought of staying in the military without being able to do the job I had trained for. Colonel Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally nodding to show he was following her story. When she finished, he was quiet for several moments before responding. That's a decision many operators face at some point in their careers, he said finally. Combat takes a toll on everyone, regardless of how tough they are or how well trained. The fact that you recognized you needed help shows wisdom, not weakness. Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes. It was the first time anyone in a position of authority had suggested that her decision to leave the military had been reasonable rather than a failure on her part. The problem I'm having now, she continued, is that the VA doesn't seem to understand what I did in the Navy. They keep asking for documentation that either doesn't exist or is classified above their clearance level. Without official recognition of my service, I can't get the disability benefits or medical coverage I was promised. Colonel Mitchell pulled out his phone and made a call. This is Mitchell. I need you to pull a complete service record for a Navy veteran. Yes, I'll hold. He covered the phone and looked at Sarah. I'm having someone at the Pentagon verify a few details in your file. This should only take a minute. While they waited, Patricia asked Sarah about her current living situation and whether she had been able to find any employment. The conversation felt surreal. Here she was, sitting in a government building, discussing her homelessness and unemployment with a high-ranking military officer who actually understood what she had been through. Mitchell here, the colonel said as his call was answered. He listened for several minutes, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification. Sarah could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was clear that whoever was on the other end had extensive knowledge about her service record. When he finally hung up, Colonel Mitchell looked at Sarah with what appeared to be newfound respect. Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I thought I understood the scope of your service based on what Patricia told me, but I clearly underestimated your contributions to our national security." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. She had never thought of her military service in terms of national security contributions. She had simply done the job she had been trained to do, to the best of her ability. "The person I just spoke with has first-hand knowledge of several operations you were involved in," the colonel continued. "He specifically mentioned an incident in Syria where your team prevented what could have been a significant international incident. He said your actions during that mission directly contributed to saving civilian lives and maintaining strategic relationships with our allies." Sarah remembered the mission he was referring to. It had been one of the most dangerous and complex operations she had ever participated in, involving the rescue of captured aid workers who had been taken hostage by a terrorist group. The political implications of the mission had been enormous, but she had focused on the tactical aspects rather than the bigger picture. "I was just doing my job, sir," she said. "Perhaps, but your job happened to involve capabilities and responsibilities that very few people in this country possess. The fact that you're not receiving the recognition and support you deserve is unacceptable." Colonel Mitchell stood up and gestured toward the door. "I think it's time we paid a visit to the benefits office downstairs and straightened out this bureaucratic confusion once and for all." The three of them took the elevator down to the first floor, where Mrs. Rodriguez was working at her desk. When she saw Sarah approaching with two people she didn't recognize, her expression became guarded. "Ms. Martinez, I told you yesterday that you would need to come back next week with additional documentation," she said before Sarah could speak. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward and placed his military ID on Mrs. Rodriguez's desk. "Good morning. I'm Colonel Mitchell from Special Operations Command. I understand you've been having difficulty verifying Ms. Martinez's service record." Mrs. Rodriguez picked up the ID and examined it carefully, her expression changing from skeptical to worried as she realized she was dealing with a high-ranking military officer. "Colonel, I was just following protocol," she said defensively. "The service record she provided doesn't match any of the standard classifications I'm familiar with." "That's understandable," Colonel Mitchell said calmly. "Ms. Martinez served in a highly classified program that wouldn't appear in standard databases. I'm here to provide official verification of her service and ensure she receives the benefits she's entitled to." He pulled out his tablet again and showed Mrs. Rodriguez the screen. "As you can see, her service record includes combat deployments, specialized training, and a medical discharge with full benefits authorized. She should have been receiving disability compensation and medical coverage for the past 18 months. Mrs. Rodriguez studied the tablet screen, her face growing pale as she read the information. "Colonel, I had no idea. The information in our system doesn't show any of these details. I sincerely apologize for any confusion." "The confusion is understandable," Colonel Mitchell replied. "But it needs to be corrected immediately. Ms. Martinez has been living without proper housing and medical care because of this oversight. I want her benefits activated today, with retroactive payments calculated from her discharge date." "Sir, I don't have the authority to authorize retroactive payments of that magnitude," Mrs. Rodriguez said nervously. "That would require approval from the regional director." Colonel Mitchell checked his watch. "Then, I suggest you call the regional director and arrange a meeting." "I'll wait." Within 20 minutes, the regional director had arrived and was reviewing Sarah's service record with Colonel Mitchell. Sarah sat quietly, still somewhat stunned by the rapid turn of events. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been sleeping in transitional housing with no prospects for getting her benefits approved. Now she was watching a Pentagon liaison officer personally ensure that her case was resolved. The regional director, a gray-haired man named Mr. Thompson, seemed genuinely apologetic as he explained the limitations of their computer systems and the lack of training for staff dealing with classified programs. "Colonel, we see very few veterans from special operations units, and even fewer from programs as highly classified as Ms. Martinez's," he said. "Our staff simply wasn't equipped to handle this type of situation." "I understand," Colonel Mitchell replied. "But there are other veterans from similar programs who may face the same issues. I'd like to work with your office to develop better procedures for handling these cases in the future." They spent the next hour working through the paperwork necessary to activate Sarah's benefits. By the time they were finished, she had been enrolled in full medical coverage, approved for disability payments, and qualified for additional benefits including housing assistance and vocational rehabilitation. As they prepared to leave the VA office, Colonel Mitchell pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that what happened here today shouldn't have been necessary. Veterans like you shouldn't have to fight bureaucracy to get the support you've earned." "I can't thank you enough, sir," Sarah said. "I honestly didn't think anyone would believe my service record, let alone go to this much trouble to help me." Colonel Mitchell handed her his business card. "I have a proposition for you. I know you left the military because of PTSD and other issues, and I understand that returning to operational duties isn't an option. But there are other ways to serve your country and use your unique skills and experience." Sarah looked at the card, which listed his title as Director of Special Programs Integration. "What kind of opportunities are you talking about, sir?" "Training and support roles for current special operations personnel. Consulting work with defense contractors. Program development for veteran transition services. Your experience gives you insights that are extremely valuable, even if you're not carrying a rifle anymore." The idea of finding meaningful work related to her military background was appealing, but Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of responsibility. "I'm still dealing with some issues from my service, Colonel. I'm not sure I'm the right person for those kinds of roles." "Ms. Martinez, every veteran deals with issues from their service. What matters is whether you're committed to managing those issues and contributing positively despite them. From what I've seen today, I believe you have that commitment." He pointed to Patricia, who was waiting nearby. Patricia here struggled with similar challenges when she left the Navy. Now she runs one of the most effective veteran support programs in this region. "Your experiences with PTSD and transition difficulties don't disqualify you from helping others, they make you better qualified to understand what they're going through." Sarah looked at Patricia with new understanding. She had suspected the older woman had military experience, but she hadn't realized the extent of it. "What Patricia didn't tell you yesterday," Colonel Mitchell continued, "is that she served in the same program you did, about 10 years earlier. She faced many of the same challenges you're dealing with now, including skepticism about her service record and difficulty getting benefits." This revelation explained why Patricia had been so understanding and why she had been able to connect Sarah with someone who could help. It also suggested that there were other women who had served in similar roles but remained largely invisible to the broader veteran community. "How many others are there?" Sarah asked. "Women who served in special operations programs?" "More than you might think, fewer than there should be," Colonel Mitchell replied. "And most of them face similar challenges when they transition to civilian life. That's part of why I think there's important work to be done in this area." As they walked out of the VA office, Sarah felt like she was emerging from a long, dark tunnel into bright sunlight. The immediate crisis of her housing and benefits had been resolved, but, more importantly, she had connected with people who understood her background and saw value in her experiences. Patricia invited Sarah to join her for lunch, and they spent the next 2 hours talking about their respective military careers and the challenges they had faced since leaving the service. It was the first time Sarah had been able to share her experiences with someone who truly understood what she had been through. "The hardest part for me wasn't the physical injuries or even the PTSD," Patricia explained over coffee. "It was feeling like I had to hide who I really was and what I had accomplished. In the military, my teammates knew my capabilities and respected me for them. In civilian life, people either didn't believe I had done those things, or they were uncomfortable with the idea of a woman in combat roles." Sarah nodded emphatically. "That's exactly how I've been feeling. Like I'm living a double life where I can't talk about the most significant years of my adult life." "It gets easier," Patricia assured her. "Especially when you find ways to use your experience to help others. The work I do now with Veteran Support Services feels like a natural extension of the mission-focused mindset we developed in the military." That evening, Sarah returned to the transitional housing facility with a fundamentally different outlook on her future. The immediate stress of homelessness and financial uncertainty had been lifted, and, for the first time in months, she could focus on longer-term goals rather than day-to-day survival. She spent several hours researching the types of opportunities Colonel Mitchell had mentioned, and she was surprised to discover how many organizations were looking for people with her specific background and skills. The challenge would be learning how to translate her military experience into terms that civilian employers could understand and value. Over the next few days, Sarah worked with a VA counselor to develop a transition plan that included temporary housing assistance, medical care for her PTSD, and career counseling. For the first time since her discharge, she felt like she had a clear path forward and people who were invested in her success. The experience had also given her a new perspective on her military service. Rather than viewing her discharge as a failure or a sign of weakness, she was beginning to understand it as a transition to a different type of service to her country and her fellow veterans. 3 weeks after her meeting with Colonel Mitchell, Sarah's life had changed dramatically. She had moved into a small apartment with the help of VA housing assistants, begun regular therapy sessions for her PTSD, and started exploring career opportunities that would allow her to use her military experience in meaningful ways. The transformation felt almost too good to be true, but she was determined to make the most of this second chance. Her first real test came when Colonel Mitchell called with an unexpected opportunity. "Sarah, I have a situation that requires someone with your specific background and security clearance. Are you interested in hearing about it?" Sarah was intrigued but cautious. "What kind of situation, sir?" "There's a training exercise scheduled at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado next week. They're testing new integration protocols for female operators, and they need someone with real operational experience to serve as an observer and consultant. The pay is good, and it would give you exposure to current special operations training methods." The idea of returning to a military environment, even temporarily, made Sarah nervous. She had worked hard to distance herself from the memories and stress associated with her service, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face that world again. "I appreciate the opportunity, Colonel, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of environment yet." "I understand your hesitation," Colonel Mitchell replied. "But I think you might be surprised by how much you have to offer. The Navy is struggling with integration issues that you've already successfully navigated. Your insights could help other women avoid some of the challenges you faced." After discussing it with Patricia and her therapist, Sarah decided to accept the assignment. She viewed it as a chance to test her own readiness for work related to her military background while contributing to improvements that might help future female operators. The flight to San Diego brought back a flood of memories as Sarah looked down at the Pacific Ocean and the familiar coastline where she had spent so many years training. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado looked exactly the same as she remembered, a sprawling complex of training facilities, administrative buildings, and the infamous obstacle courses that had challenged her both physically and mentally during her initial training. She was met at the base entrance by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chan, a naval officer who would be coordinating the training exercise. As they drove through the base, Lieutenant Commander Chan briefed her on the current status of female integration in special operations. "We've made significant progress since your time in service," she explained. "Women are now officially allowed in SEAL training, but the completion rates are still very low. We're trying to understand whether that's due to physical standards, cultural barriers, or training methods that aren't optimized for female physiology and psychology." Sarah listened with interest as they discussed the various theories about why female integration had been challenging. Some of it matched her own experiences, while other aspects had apparently improved significantly since her time in the program. "The interesting thing is that women who do complete the training tend to perform exceptionally well in operational environments," Lieutenant Commander Chan continued. "Their success rates on actual missions are comparable to or better than their male counterparts. The challenge seems to be in the training pipeline itself." They arrived at a conference room where Sarah was introduced to the other personnel involved in the exercise: active duty SEALs, training instructors, psychologists, and medical personnel. She was surprised by how welcoming and respectful everyone was, a marked contrast to the skepticism and hostility she had often encountered during her own training years earlier. The exercise was designed to test whether modifications to certain aspects of SEAL training would improve female completion rates without compromising the overall standards or effectiveness of the program. Sarah's role was to observe the training activities and provide feedback based on her own experiences and insights. Over the next 3 days, she watched groups of female candidates go through modified versions of various training evolutions: ocean swims, obstacle courses, combat simulations, and team-building exercises. What struck her most was how much the culture had changed since her own time in training. The male instructors were professional and supportive rather than openly hostile, and the female candidates seemed more confident and less defensive than Sarah remembered feeling during her own training. There was still obvious tension and stress, but it felt more like the natural pressure of demanding training rather than the additional burden of proving that women belonged there. During breaks in the training schedule, Sarah had opportunities to speak with some of the female candidates about their experiences. Their stories were both familiar and different from her own. They faced many of the same physical and mental challenges, but they seemed to have more institutional support and fewer cultural barriers than Sarah had encountered. "What's different now is that everyone knows women can do this job," explained Petty Officer Lisa Rodriguez, a candidate who was in her final phase of training. "We're not fighting to prove that it's possible, we're just trying to meet the same standards as everyone else." Sarah found herself thinking about her own training experience and how much energy she had spent trying to prove herself worthy of being there rather than simply focusing on meeting the standards. The psychological burden of feeling like she represented all women in combat roles had been enormous, and she was relieved to see that current candidates didn't seem to carry that same weight. On the second day of the exercise, Sarah was observing a combat simulation when one of the candidates was injured during a fast rope exercise. The young woman had twisted her ankle badly during landing and was clearly in significant pain, but she was trying to continue with the training evolution. Sarah watched as the candidate limped through the rest of the exercise, clearly favoring her injured ankle but refusing to quit or ask for medical attention. It was a scenario Sarah remembered all too well from her own training, the fear that any sign of weakness or vulnerability would be used as evidence that women weren't tough enough for special operations. When the exercise ended, Sarah approached the injured candidate, who was sitting alone trying to massage her swollen ankle. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked. The young woman, whose name tag read Morrison, looked up with a mixture of pain and determination. "It's fine. Just a minor twist. I can push through it." Sarah sat down beside her. "Morrison, I need to tell you something that no one told me during my training. There's a difference between pushing through discomfort and risking permanent injury. If that ankle is seriously damaged and you keep training on it, you could end up with chronic problems that affect you for the rest of your life." Morrison looked skeptical. "Ma'am, with respect, I can't afford to show weakness here. If I go to medical for something like this, they'll use it as an excuse to drop me from the program." Sarah understood the young woman's fear completely. "I know it feels that way, but let me ask you something. If one of your male classmates had the same injury, what would you advise him to do?" Morrison considered this for a moment. "I'd tell him to get it checked out by medical. Better to miss a few days of training than risk a career-ending injury." "Then, why should the standard be different for you?" After some discussion, Morrison agreed to visit the medical facility, where an X-ray revealed a hairline fracture that could have become much worse if she had continued training on it. She was placed on limited duty for 2 weeks, during which time she could continue with academic training while her ankle healed. The incident reminded Sarah of one of the most valuable lessons she had learned during her own military service, that true strength sometimes meant knowing when to ask for help or admit limitations. She made a note to include this observation in her final report about the training exercise. On the final day of her assignment, Sarah was asked to address the group of candidates and share some thoughts about her experiences and observations. Standing in front of the conference room, looking at the faces of young women who were following a path she had helped pioneer, she felt a sense of pride and responsibility that surprised her. "When I went through this training 10 years ago, I felt like I was carrying the weight of every woman who might want to serve in special operations," she began. "I was so focused on proving that women belonged here that I sometimes lost sight of why I wanted to be here in the first place." She looked around the room at the attentive faces. "What I've learned since then is that you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of this opportunity. You don't have to prove that all women are capable of this job, you just have to prove that you are capable of this job. And you don't have to sacrifice your health or your values to demonstrate your toughness. She shared some specific examples from her own training and deployment experiences, emphasizing lessons about teamwork, resilience, and the importance of supporting your teammates regardless of gender. By the time she finished her presentation, Sarah felt like she had contributed something meaningful to the next generation of female special operators. As she prepared to leave Coronado, Lieutenant Commander Chen pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Sarah, I want you to know that your observations and recommendations are going to have a significant impact on how we structure future training programs. You've helped us identify several areas where we can make improvements without lowering standards." "I'm glad I could help," Sarah replied. "It feels good to contribute to something positive rather than just struggling with my own issues. Actually, that brings up something I wanted to discuss with you. We're developing a new program to provide mentoring and support for female candidates in special operations training. We need someone with operational experience who understands the unique challenges these women face. Would you be interested in a position like that?" The offer was tempting, but Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for that level of responsibility. "It sounds like important work, but I'm still dealing with some personal issues from my own service. I'd hate to let people down if I'm not ready for it." Lieutenant Commander Chen nodded understandingly. "The position wouldn't start for another 6 months, which would give you time to continue working on your own recovery. And, honestly, the fact that you're aware of your limitations and committed to addressing them makes you exactly the kind of person we need in a role like this." On the flight back to Phoenix, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her perspective had changed in just a few weeks. The woman who had been sleeping in her car and fighting for basic recognition of her service had discovered that she had valuable contributions to make to her country and her fellow veterans. When she arrived home, she called Patricia to share her experiences from the training exercise. They met for dinner that evening, and Sarah described the changes she had observed in special operations culture and training methods. "It sounds like your presence there made a real difference," Patricia observed. "Not just in terms of your official observations, but in providing support and guidance to the current candidates." Sarah nodded. "It felt good to be able to help them avoid some of the mistakes I made. And it made me realize that my experiences, even the difficult ones, have value beyond just my own personal growth." Over the following weeks, Sarah continued working with her therapist to process her military experiences while exploring various career opportunities. She began volunteering with Patricia's veteran support group, sharing her story with other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. What surprised her most was how many people responded positively to her willingness to discuss both her achievements and her struggles. Rather than seeing her PTSD and discharge as signs of failure, other veterans seemed to appreciate her honesty about the challenges of military service and the difficulty of transitioning to civilian life. One evening, while facilitating a group discussion about combat trauma, Sarah realized that she had found a sense of purpose and mission that she had been missing since leaving the military. Helping other veterans navigate their own challenges felt like a natural extension of the teamwork and mutual support that had been central to her military service. The work wasn't easy, and there were days when listening to other people's trauma stories triggered her own difficult memories. But, with the support of her therapist and the veteran community she had become part of, she was learning to manage these challenges while still contributing meaningfully to something larger than herself. Colonel Mitchell called periodically to check on her progress and share information about other opportunities that might interest her. During one conversation, he mentioned that the Pentagon was developing new programs specifically focused on supporting veterans from classified special operations programs. "There's growing recognition that people like you face unique challenges that regular veteran services aren't equipped to handle," he explained. "We're looking for people with first-hand experience to help develop and implement these programs." Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of contributing to systemic improvements that could help veterans in situations similar to what she had experienced. "What kind of timeline are we talking about for these programs?" "Development is still in early stages, but implementation could begin within the next year or two. I'll keep you informed as things develop, and I hope you'll consider getting involved when the time is right." As spring turned to summer, Sarah's life had stabilized in ways she hadn't thought possible just a few months earlier. She had steady housing, regular income from her VA benefits and consulting work, and a support network of people who understood and valued her experiences. More importantly, she had begun to see her military service and subsequent struggles as part of a larger story rather than isolated experiences that defined her limitations. The skills, knowledge, and perspectives she had gained through both her successes and her challenges were proving to be valuable resources for helping other people navigate similar situations. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had shown her that recovery from trauma and transition to meaningful civilian life were possible, even for someone with her complex background. She was beginning to believe that her best years of service to her country might still be ahead of her, rather than behind her. 6 months after her assignment at Coronado, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of her life once again. The caller identified himself as General Robert Hayes, Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command, and he wanted to meet with her about a developing situation that required her unique expertise. "Ms. Martinez, I've been following your work with veteran transition programs and your consulting on training integration issues," General Hayes said. "I have a situation that requires someone with your specific background and security clearance, and, frankly, there aren't many people who meet those qualifications." Sarah was intrigued but cautious. Her experiences over the past year had taught her to be selective about the commitments she made, especially those that might trigger her PTSD symptoms or interfere with her ongoing recovery. "What kind of situation are we talking about, General?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details in person, if you're willing to travel to Washington. The matter involves potential security breaches related to classified special operations programs, and we need someone who can provide insights from both operational and civilian perspectives." The mention of security breaches concerned Sarah. She had always been careful about protecting classified information from her military service, and the idea that there might be problems in that area was troubling. "General, I'd be happy to help if I can, but I want to be upfront about my current situation. I'm still dealing with some issues related to my military service, and I need to make sure I don't take on responsibilities that exceed my current capabilities." General Hayes' response surprised her. "Ms. Martinez, the fact that you're aware of your limitations and committed to managing them responsibly is exactly why I want you involved in this situation. We need someone who understands both the operational requirements and the human costs of special operations work." After discussing the matter with Patricia and her therapist, Sarah agreed to travel to Washington for a briefing. She flew into Reagan National Airport on a gray February morning and was met by a military aide who drove her to the Pentagon. Walking through the corridors of the Pentagon brought back a flood of memories from her active duty years. The familiar sights, sounds, and smells of the massive building reminded her of briefings, planning sessions, and the intense focus that characterized military operations. But, this time, instead of feeling overwhelmed by those memories, she felt a sense of purpose and belonging that she had missed during her civilian transition. General Hayes met her in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon complex. He was a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of significant responsibility. Despite his rank and the formal setting, he greeted Sarah warmly and thanked her for making the trip. "Before we begin, I want you to know that your service record speaks for itself," he said. "The operations you participated in had strategic importance that extended far beyond their immediate tactical objectives. Your contributions to national security have been significant, even if they haven't been publicly recognized." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in understanding why she had been called to Washington. "Thank you, General. What can I help you with?" General Hayes activated a secure display screen and began briefing her on a complex situation that had been developing over several months. A former Navy SEAL named Marcus Webb had been arrested by civilian authorities for impersonating a military officer and fraudulently claiming benefits he wasn't entitled to. Initially, it had seemed like a straightforward case of military impersonation, but further investigation had revealed troubling complications. Webb has been claiming to be a former SEAL with multiple combat deployments and decorations for valor, General Hayes explained. The problem is that some of his claims appear to be based on actual classified operations that he shouldn't have any knowledge of unless he was either directly involved or had access to highly classified information. Sarah studied the files and photographs that General Hayes provided. Marcus Webb appeared to be in his early 30s, with the physical build and appearance that would make his claims about special operations service plausible to civilian audiences. What makes this particularly concerning, the general continued, is that Webb has been using his false credentials to gain access to veteran events, support groups, and even some security-related employment opportunities. If he has somehow obtained classified information about actual operations, the security implications could be severe. As Sarah reviewed the evidence, she began to understand why her involvement had been requested. Several of the operations that Webb had claimed to be involved in were missions she had actually participated in. The level of detail he provided about certain aspects of these operations was uncomfortably accurate. General, looking at this information, Webb knows details about operational procedures and outcomes that weren't widely disseminated, even within the special operations community. Either he was actually involved in these operations in some capacity, or he has access to sources of information that represents serious security breaches. General Hayes nodded gravely. That's exactly our concern. We need someone who was actually involved in these operations to interview Webb and determine how he obtained this information. Your unique perspective as both an operational participant and someone who understands civilian veteran communities makes you ideal for this role. The assignment would involve traveling to the federal facility where Webb was being held and conducting a series of interviews designed to determine the source of his information. Sarah would need to use her knowledge of the actual operations to identify discrepancies in Webb's claims while trying to understand how he had obtained accurate information about classified activities. I'm willing to help, Sarah said, but I want to understand what safeguards will be in place to protect both the classified information and my own well-being during these interviews. General Hayes outlined a comprehensive support structure that would include psychological counseling, security personnel, and legal protections to ensure that Sarah's involvement in the investigation wouldn't compromise either her personal recovery or operational security. Over the next week, Sarah prepared for the interviews by reviewing classified files about the operations Webb had claimed to be involved in. It was the first time she had examined detailed documentation about missions she had participated in, and the experience was both fascinating and emotionally challenging. Reading official accounts of operations she remembered vividly brought back intense memories of combat situations, decision-making under pressure, and the loss of teammates she had tried hard to forget. But it also helped her understand the broader strategic context of her service and the importance of the work she had been involved in. The federal facility where Webb was held was located outside Washington, and Sarah's first meeting with him took place in a secure interview room with both audio and video recording capabilities. Webb was a physically imposing man with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to being believed and respected. From the moment Sarah entered the room, Webb seemed to recognize that she represented a different kind of challenge than the civilian investigators and military personnel he had been dealing with previously. His initial attempts to charm her with war stories and claims of shared experiences were met with professional skepticism rather than the admiration or disbelief he was apparently used to receiving. "So you're the expert they brought in to debunk my service," Webb said with a slight smirk. "Let me guess, you read some files and think you know what really happened in those operations." Sarah remained calm and professional. "Mr. Webb, I'm here to understand how you obtained the information you've been sharing about classified military operations. Some of what you've claimed shows knowledge that could only come from direct involvement or access to highly classified sources." Over the next several hours, Sarah systematically questioned Webb about specific details of operations he claimed to have participated in. His responses revealed an interesting pattern. He had extensive knowledge about certain aspects of these missions, but significant gaps in understanding about others. When asked about tactical details that would have been known to all team members, Webb sometimes gave vague or incorrect answers. But, when questioned about strategic objectives or operational outcomes, his information was often remarkably accurate and detailed. "Mr. Webb, you've described the strategic importance of Operation Desert Wind with impressive accuracy," Sarah observed. "But, when I asked you about the specific insertion method used by your team, you couldn't provide basic details that any participant would remember clearly."
Webb's confident demeanor began to crack as Sarah's questioning continued.
It became increasingly apparent that his knowledge came from sources other than direct participation in these operations.
"Where did you really get this information?" Sarah asked directly. After hours of denying any deception, Webb finally began to reveal the truth.
His knowledge came from a combination of sources: leaked documents he had obtained through online forums, information shared by actual veterans who trusted him because of his false claims, and details he had pieced together from public sources and media accounts. But the most troubling revelation came when Webb admitted that some of his information had come from a civilian contractor who had worked in intelligence analysis and had access to classified operational reports.
"This contractor," Sarah asked, "what was his name and how did you meet him?"
Webb identified the contractor as Dr. James Sullivan, a former intelligence analyst who had been providing consulting services to defense companies. According to Webb, Sullivan had been sharing classified information in exchange for payment and had recruited Webb to help legitimize and disseminate this information through veteran communities. The scope of the security breach was larger than anyone had initially suspected. Dr. Sullivan had potentially compromised multiple classified operations by sharing detailed information with unauthorized individuals who were then using it to support false claims about their military service. Sarah immediately reported these findings to General Hayes, who launched a comprehensive investigation into Dr. Sullivan's activities and potential security breaches. The investigation revealed that Sullivan had been selling classified information to multiple individuals over a period of several years, potentially compromising operational security for numerous special operations missions. The case had significant implications beyond just the immediate security breaches. It highlighted vulnerabilities in how classified information was protected after operations concluded and raised questions about vetting procedures for civilian contractors with access to sensitive intelligence. As the investigation expanded, Sarah found herself playing an increasingly important role in identifying compromised operations and assessing potential damage to national security. Her unique combination of operational experience and understanding of veteran communities made her invaluable in understanding how classified information was being misused. The work was challenging and sometimes emotionally difficult, as it required her to revisit traumatic memories and confront the reality that operations she had risked her life to complete had been compromised by someone seeking financial gain. But it also gave her a sense of purpose and mission that she had been missing since leaving active duty. General Hayes recognized Sarah's contributions and offered her a permanent position with Special Operations Command focused on security analysis and veteran affairs. The role would allow her to use her unique background to help prevent similar security breaches while also contributing to programs that supported transitioning special operations veterans. "Sarah, what you've accomplished during this investigation demonstrates exactly the kind of capabilities we need in this organization," General Hayes told her during their final briefing. "You've shown that it's possible to use personal experience with trauma and transition as strengths rather than limitations." The offer represented everything Sarah had hoped for when she first left the military: meaningful work that utilized her skills and experience while contributing to something larger than herself. But accepting it would also mean fully embracing her identity as a veteran and acknowledging the value of experiences she had spent years trying to forget. After discussing the opportunity with Patricia, her therapist, and Colonel Mitchell, Sarah decided to accept the position. The work would be based in Washington, but would involve travel to military installations and veteran communities around the country. As she prepared to relocate and begin this new phase of her career, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had sat in her car outside the VA office, wondering if anyone would ever believe her service record. The journey from homelessness and despair to meaningful employment and recognition had not been easy or straightforward. It had required her to confront difficult memories, ask for help when she needed it, and learn to see her experiences as sources of strength rather than shame. Most importantly, it had shown her that recovery from trauma and successful transition to civilian life were possible, even for someone with complex challenges and a background that didn't fit traditional categories. Her experiences had prepared her to help other veterans navigate similar transitions while contributing to national security in ways that drew directly on her unique background and insights. Standing in her new office at the Pentagon, looking out at the Virginia landscape where she had begun her military career years earlier, Sarah felt a sense of completion and new beginning simultaneously. The woman who had once been dismissed as a fake SEAL was now helping to protect the security of the very operations she had once participated in. The circular nature of her journey was not lost on her. She had started as an outsider fighting to prove she belonged in special operations, became an insider who excelled in that environment, struggled to find her place in civilian life, and, finally, discovered that her true calling was helping bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. Her story had become one of resilience, redemption, and the power of finding purpose in helping others overcome challenges similar to those she had faced herself. And, while the future would undoubtedly bring new challenges and opportunities, Sarah finally felt confident that she had the tools, support, and sense of mission necessary to meet them successfully. The mark that General Hayes had recognized was not just her military service record or her operational achievements. It was the combination of strength and vulnerability, experience and wisdom, individual capability and commitment to others that marked her as someone uniquely qualified to serve her country in this new capacity. In the end, the question had never been whether Sarah was a real SEAL or whether she deserved recognition for her service. The question had been whether she could find a way to use her experiences, both positive and negative, to contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself. The answer, as General Hayes had recognized from the beginning, had always been yes.